hadn't planned to be at the Harrington Grand Hotel that night. The charity gala was one of those glittering events that sounded better in conversation than in reality. Overpriced champagne, silent auctions for things nobody needed, and conversations that started with smiles but always ended in business cards. I usually found a way out of them, citing work or prior commitments. But this one, I got roped in. A couple of mutual acquaintances, people Melissa and I both knew, had pressed me to attend, saying it would be good for connections and a nice evening out. I could already hear Melissa's voice teasing me for being antisocial if I skipped it, so I gave in. Slipped into my black suit, knotted a conservative tie, and told myself it would be harmless. The Harrington Grand was dressed to impress. The marble floors gleamed, reflecting chandeliers that dripped with crystal. A string quartet played somewhere off to my left, their music weaving through the murmur of polite conversation. The air smelled faintly of perfume, champagne, and the kind of expensive cologne you only ever notice in crowds like this. I signed in, exchanged a few greetings with familiar faces, and scanned the ballroom. That's when I saw her. Melissa, my wife. She was seated at a round table toward the far side of the room, just close enough to the dance floor to catch the glow of the chandelier above. Her hair, swept up in a loose chignon, caught the light every time she turned her head. She wore a black evening dress with an understated elegance, simple, but the kind of simple that made you look twice. And she wasn't alone. Sitting beside her was Mark Reeves. The name might not have meant much to anyone else in the room, but to me it landed like a subtle but deliberate tap on the shoulder. Years ago, Mark had been in our house, not socially but professionally. He'd been the contractor who installed our home security system, walking from room to room with quiet efficiency, occasionally making small talk about the weather or traffic. We'd never shared a drink, never even talked outside of that job. He was a guy you forget about 2 weeks after he leaves. Except I hadn't forgotten, and seeing him there, seated beside my wife, lit up a strange, sharp corner of my memory. Melissa's hand was resting lightly on his shoulder. Not a possessive grip, not anything overt, just fingertips resting there as if in the middle of an easy conversation. To the untrained eye, it might have seemed friendly, almost casual. But I knew my wife's body language. I knew the subtle way she leaned in when she was truly invested in a conversation. The slight tilt of her head that signaled not just interest but comfort. This wasn't small talk. They were laughing together, real, unfiltered laughter that softened the edges of their faces. His hand rested on the table beside hers, not touching but close enough that the space between them felt deliberate. A champagne flute was in Melissa's other hand, catching the golden light with every movement. And then I saw it. Beside them, half tucked behind her chair, sat a glossy black gift bag from a high-end men's boutique in the city. I recognized the logo instantly. I'd been there myself once, years ago, when I needed a last-minute anniversary gift. Their prices weren't the kind of thing you spent on a casual acquaintance. I didn't move at first. I just stood there watching, my mind sifting through a dozen possible explanations, most of them innocent or at least trying to be. Maybe it was part of some raffle or silent auction prize. Maybe it wasn't for him at all. But the longer I stood there, the less convincing those possibilities became. Finally, I started walking toward them. My steps were slow, deliberate. I let my eyes drift to the other tables as I crossed the room, giving the appearance of a man casually mingling. Inside, though, my chest felt tight, my pulse steady but heavy, like my body had already decided this moment was important. Melissa spotted me when I was still a few steps away. Her eyes widened almost imperceptibly. Not enough for anyone else to notice, but I caught it. In a single smooth motion, she withdrew her hand from Mark's shoulder and let it fall into her lap. "Ethan," she said warmly, as if my arrival had been expected. "I was wondering when you'd get here." Her voice was light, easy, and she smiled the kind of smile people save for public settings. Bright, polished, but without the warmth I knew from private moments. "Melissa," I said evenly, nodding to her before turning my attention to Mark. "Mark Reeves, right?" He smiled politely, rising slightly from his chair to shake my hand. "That's right. Been a while." "It has." I said. Last time I saw you, you were wiring motion sensors into our living room. He chuckled, a short, practiced sound. That's right. Small world, isn't it? Melissa jumped in before I could respond, steering the conversation like someone redirecting a river before it hit a sharp bend. We were just talking about the silent auction, she said, her tone casual. Mark was telling me about some of the higher bids coming in for the art pieces. That's so? I asked, glancing briefly at the gift bag. Looks like you've already won something. She followed my gaze for the briefest moment before looking back at me. Oh, that? Just a raffle giveaway. For the table. Mark nodded in agreement, though his eyes didn't quite meet mine when he did. We made a few minutes of harmless small talk, charity numbers, the music, some bland comment about the turnout. To anyone nearby, it would have looked like 3 people exchanging polite conversation, maybe even old acquaintances catching up. Nothing remarkable. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I just walked into the middle of something, like opening a book to a random page and finding a conversation already in motion, one I wasn't meant to hear. After a few moments, I excused myself under the pretense of checking out the auction items. Melissa smiled, nodded, and turned back to Mark almost before I'd finished speaking. As I walked away, I could still feel the image burned into my mind. Her hand on his shoulder, the two of them leaning in, and that glossy black gift bag catching the light like it had a story of its own. I told myself I'd let it go. But even then, I knew I wouldn't. I didn't sleep the night of the gala. I lay on my back and watched the red digits of the clock crawl forward, listening to the soft mechanical breath of the house we'd built together. The same house a former contractor had once mapped room by room. Funny what sticks. I kept seeing Melissa's hand on Mark's shoulder, that easy curve of her wrist, the way their bodies angled as if the rest of the room were background noise. Nothing I could quote. Nothing I could hold up like a smoking G***N. Just posture. Just timing. Just a gift bag that didn't belong to us. By sunrise, I'd convinced myself I was being dramatic. People laugh. People touch. Charity galas manufacture closeness the way fog machines manufacture weather. I made coffee, poured 2 mugs, and almost called out her name. She wasn't home. Right, the aftermixer with donors she'd mentioned so casually at the event. She came in around 8, hair pinned back, makeup softened, carrying the kind of clean air that smells like a lobby instead of night. She kissed my cheek like we were fine. Long night? I asked. Productive, she said, slipping off her heels. Donor chatter. You know how it is. I smiled like I did know. I didn't. Melissa works in partnerships, but lately the specifics were a moving target, new projects, new timelines, new acronyms. Those timelines kept stretching, too, but the edges never matched what her company posted. I checked once or twice, just curiosity. Either their communications team was chronically behind, or she had a schedule that lived only between her mouth and my trust. Her phone lived face down now. That was new. It used to be upside down only during dinner, a small courtesy we agreed on years ago. Then it was all the time. Calls came in and she'd step into the hall, lowering her voice to a careful whisper meant to sound casual. I never caught words, only that tone people use when they think the walls are listening. And then there was the scent. Not mine. Not hers either. Something citrusy with a cool metallic edge. A cologne I couldn't place. It arrived like a rumor, faint the first time, undeniable the third. When I asked, she smiled. Elevator transfer, she joked. I got hugged by somebody's aftershave. I laughed, and for a minute I let the explanation wrap around me like a warm towel. After all, people do wear cologne. Elevators exist. But the smell came back, always on nights with urgent meetings. New jewelry started appearing without fanfare. A thin gold bracelet, studs shaped like tiny stars, a necklace with a small onyx pendant that caught the kitchen light in a way that made me think of secrets. I'd ask about them softly, like a man who didn't want to sound like an auditor. Oh, she'd say, waving a hand. Gifts from project partners. Everyone's feeling generous this quarter. Then she'd change the subject to something safe, like whether we should repaint the guest room. Her cousin Jenna began dropping by more often around then. Jenna runs Brightcore Dynamics, A name that sounds like a lamp and behaves like a company, though I've never fully understood what it sells beyond solutions. Melissa loved being around her, loved the sense of momentum that trailed Jenna like perfume. They'd sit at our counter with laptops open, talking in quick bursts that sounded like rehearsed dialogue. Every time I walked in, the conversation folded closed like a pocket knife. "Hey, babe," Melissa would say, smiling too brightly. "Want anything from the bakery?" Maybe I could have bought all of it if the timing hadn't been so precise. The disappearances, the jewelry, the new perfume that wasn't perfume, and the memory that kept tapping inside my skull. Mark Reeves moving through our living room years ago, kneeling at the baseboards, explaining sensors to Melissa while I signed forms at the counter. He looked at her more than at me. At the time, I chalked it up to customer service. Now, looking backward, I felt my stomach tighten around the old scene the way a fist closes. "Do you remember Mark?" I asked her that Saturday morning, the first after the gala, as if his name were a trivia question. "The contractor?" she said, too fast. "Sure. Why?" "Ran into him at the gala," I said, keeping my tone light. "Didn't know you two were friendly." She slid a spoon around her coffee. "He donated a security package to the auction," she said. "Jenna introduced us last year. He's been doing work with a few of her clients." That could be true. It sounded true in that practiced way truth sometimes wears when it's being escorted down a hallway. I nodded. "Makes sense." She smiled and offered me half her croissant. I didn't take it. Small, petty refusal. It felt like placing a pebble on a scale no one else could see. After that, my brain became an amateur archivist. I started remembering details I hadn't bothered to store properly. The Tuesday nights that stretched into Wednesdays. The sudden insistence on separate laundry. The new passcode on her phone she entered with the smooth rhythm of someone who'd done it 100 times. She changed her passwords often, she said, for security hygiene. Maybe. We used to share a streaming login without thinking about it. Now even the banal stuff felt gated. A few times I considered checking the phone bill, and a few times I didn't. There's a particular humiliation in turning yourself into a detective inside your own marriage. Once you start, you can't pretend you're not doing it. You can't claim the high ground while squinting through binoculars. So I waited. I told myself I'd know when I needed to know. Meanwhile, the scent of that cologne followed her through the door like a polite guest. The house altered in small ways. Her shoes no longer piled by the entry. They lined up in neat pairs as if always ready for inspection. She started staging the living room before I got home. Pillows squared, throws folded, like we were a listing preparing for a showing. When I asked why, she laughed. "It calms me," she said. I believed her because the alternative, that she was preparing alibis inside the physical space of our life, felt like an accusation I wasn't ready to make. I kept replaying the gala scene in my head, slowing it down, swapping angles like I could edit my way to certainty. I remembered the way Mark's hand hovered near hers on the table, not touching, but touching the idea of touching. I remembered the gift bag. Later, I checked the boutique site. Their bags are seasonal. The one at the table was current, new, not something that had lived in a closet and been repurposed for optics. What surprised me most wasn't anger. It was the sadness that arrived early, ahead of any confession. Grief without a death certificate. I found myself staring at the coffee machine in the morning, unable to decide if I was mourning the past or pre-mourning a future I hadn't lost yet. Both probably. One evening, about a week after the gala, Melissa came home humming. She doesn't hum. She set her bag down and floated through the kitchen like she'd been let in on a joke the rest of us would hear later. "Good day?" I asked. She nodded, opened the fridge and pulled out sparkling water. "Great," she said. "We locked in a new partnership." "With who?" She hesitated a fraction too long. "A tech client. Through Jenna." "Mark's company?" I asked, trying to sound as if the name had just occurred to me. She gave me a sideways look, playful but edged. "He's not a tech client," she said. "He's adjacent." A shrug. "Anyway, Jenna's handling most of it." Adjacent. Funny word. Close enough to touch, far enough to deny. I nodded and let the pause sit between us like a third chair at the island. At night, when Melissa showered, steam ghosted under the door and the bathroom filled with that not quite familiar scent. Rinsed now, like the afterimage of a stranger passing you on the sidewalk. I lay awake, counting the spaces between her breaths and mine, measuring the small distances that had grown up like ivy around the furniture of our life. I tried once to say something plain. "You seem distracted lately." She looked up from her laptop. "We're just busy, Ethan." "We?" I repeated. She smiled. "Me, the team. Jenna. You know." I did know. And I didn't. Both things were true and canceling each other out. There's a version of me that confronts, demands, corners truth until it has to bark or bite. But the version living in our house practiced patience like a discipline. Not because I was afraid of an answer, though maybe I was, but because I wanted a whole picture, not a single, deniable moment. I told myself that waiting was strategic. Sometimes strategy is just fear wearing a suit. Still, I started tracking patterns. Thursday nights stretched longer than any other night. Her mood on Fridays was oddly buoyant, like someone returning from a place where the light is different. Weekend mornings, she guarded her phone the way a traveler guards a passport. And twice, she came home with that onyx pendant turned the other way, clasp resting in front like she'd put it back on in a hurry. I didn't have proof. I had a mosaic of almosts, and from a distance the picture was getting clearer. By the time my suspicions hardened into something more than unease, I'd already stopped trusting my own memory. The little details stacked up, but they were soft evidence. Things she could wave away with the right combination of humor and offense. I needed something that couldn't be laughed off. The first crack came from an unexpected angle: corporate paperwork. One Monday morning, over coffee I barely tasted, I called an old acquaintance. Someone I'd done work for years ago, who now sat in a position to see the things most people assumed were hidden. We talked about nothing for a few minutes before I shifted, casually, into the request. Access to corporate expense records for Brightcore Dynamics. "Just curious about some overlapping projects," I said, my tone light. Melissa mentioned a couple names I didn't recognize. It was a flimsy cover, but he didn't ask questions. A few days later, an encrypted folder appeared in my inbox. I waited until Melissa left for the evening. Another last-minute dinner with Jenna. Before opening it, the files were dull at first. Catering invoices, mileage reimbursements, random hotel stays for employees I didn't know. Then I started filtering by Melissa's name. The pattern emerged quickly. Business class tickets to Miami. Twice. Paid for through Jenna's corporate account, but with Melissa's full name on the passenger list. I clicked into the attached itinerary. The second passenger's name was familiar even before I finished reading it. Mark Reeves. I sat back in my chair, letting the cursor blink at me like it was keeping time. Miami. Not a conference city for her line of work. And why Mark? He wasn't Brightcore staff. His name didn't belong anywhere near these expenses. The receipts told the rest. Private dinners at places with tasting menus and wine pairings that cost more than my monthly car payment. Yacht rentals. Spa treatments for two. All charged through Brightcore and signed off under Jenna's approval code. I told myself I needed to stop there. But I didn't. I searched again, this time for images. Anything uploaded as part of expense justifications or proof of client engagement. It didn't take long. A PDF of scanned receipts included photographs, probably meant to show the board that money had been spent entertaining potential partners. The first photo was of Melissa and Mark on the deck of a white yacht, the ocean behind them turning gold in the late afternoon. She was wearing a sundress I'd never seen before. He had his arm slung casually around her shoulders, his hand resting exactly where hers had been on his at the gala. The next was worse. They were in a restaurant, seated close enough that their knees had to be touching. Melissa was laughing, really laughing, head tilted back, eyes half closed. Mark was looking at her like she was the only person in the room. There were more. Poolside, in a hotel lobby, walking along a pier, her hand slipped loosely into his. All of them dressed like they'd been away from anything resembling work for days. I closed the folder and sat there in the dark, the blue glow of the monitor making the rest of the room disappear. If you'd asked me before that moment how I'd react to undeniable proof, I might have said rage. Some messy, cinematic outburst. But sitting there, all I felt was a kind of quiet finality. Like someone had just shut a heavy door behind me and the sound was still ringing in my ears. It wasn't even just the cheating. It was the fact that she'd woven it into her work, using Jenna's company like camouflage. It was the hours I'd sat across from her at our own kitchen table while she smiled and lied without missing a beat. For the first time, I realized I didn't want an explanation. Explanations are for misunderstandings, for bad timing, for mistakes. This was deliberate, and deliberate required something else entirely. Still, I needed one more confirmation, something recent, not just a trail of receipts from months past. That chance came faster than I expected. Melissa mentioned she'd be working late the following Thursday. The phrasing was familiar, almost a script. I waited until her location on the shared car service app updated, then tracked the trip. She wasn't headed toward her office. She wasn't headed anywhere near Jenna's either. She was going downtown, to a hotel I recognized from one of the Miami receipts. Not in the same city, of course, but part of the same boutique chain. I drove separately, taking side streets to avoid arriving too soon. When I reached the block, I parked far enough away to watch the revolving glass doors. 15 minutes later, she walked out with Mark. They weren't holding hands, but their body language was as loud as any kiss. They moved together in a way people only do when they've practiced it. Shoulders aligned, strides matched, the occasional lean in to share a private word. He carried a shopping bag, the brand name visible even from where I sat. I'd bought her a scarf from the same store 2 Christmases ago. They crossed the street toward a restaurant. I let them get half a block ahead before following. The place had high windows, the kind you can see into if you stand just right. They took a booth near the back, sliding in on the same side instead of across from each other. She took his hand almost immediately. I didn't watch for long. I didn't need to. I had enough images burned into my mind already. Back in my car, I felt the anger return. Not the blinding kind, but something colder and more deliberate. A steady burn like coals that can last all night. Proof was no longer the question. The question was what to do with it. I could confront her right away, lay everything out and watch her scramble. But I already knew what she'd say, how she'd reach for the same lines people have been using for centuries. It's not what it looks like. I can explain. It's over now. You're imagining things. I wasn't interested in giving her the stage, so I started thinking in terms she'd understand. Strategy, position, timing. That night, I backed up everything. The expense reports, the photos, copies of every receipt with both their names. Even the car service record showing her trip to the hotel. I stored it all where she couldn't touch it, even if she guessed. Then I made a list, not of what she'd done, but of what she valued. The names of people she needed to impress. The accounts she and Jenna depended on. The places where her reputation wasn't just decoration, but currency. If Melissa wanted to conduct her affair in the shadows of her professional life, I'd make sure the light reached both. I closed my laptop around midnight, the plan only half-formed but already taking shape. It wouldn't be loud. It wouldn't be rushed. It would be complete. The night I decided not to confront her was the first night I slept in weeks. Not well, but enough to understand something important. Rage burns fast, strategy burns slow. I didn't need an explosion. I needed erosion. Melissa had given me the outline herself over the years, usually without realizing it. Over wine at the kitchen counter, she'd complain about Jenna's over-leveraged position at Brightcore Dynamics, the way the company relied on a handful of key contracts to keep the whole machine running. She'd talk about how small shareholders were dead weight, unless they were active enough to be dangerous. Those fragments became the bones of my plan. I started with a name that meant nothing to her, Weston Vale Holdings. It was a shelf company, one of those quiet little legal entities that exists only on paper and in the minds of the people who know how to use them. I'd acquired it years earlier for a side project that never got off the ground. Now it had a purpose. Through Weston Vale, I began buying up Brightcore's debt. Small pieces at first, enough to pass unnoticed. I purchased them through offshore structures, layering the transactions until they looked like nothing more than the slow churn of normal market activity. A fraction of a percent here, another there. While that moved in the background, I worked the other side of the equation, perception. I had friends in places Jenna had always assumed were hers alone. Editors at trade publications, analysts who liked a good rumor as much as a good fact. Anonymously, I started feeding them pieces of information. Nothing directly false, just curated. A suggestion that Brightcore's Q3 numbers would disappoint. A hint that a major client was reconsidering their renewal. A vague mention of potential compliance issues in overseas markets. The stories began to appear in the right circles, tight-knit business newsletters, whispered sidebars at networking events, casual posts from industry insiders on LinkedIn. Each one small enough to deny, but together forming the kind of smoke that makes people assume there's a fire. I didn't rush. Timing mattered. I wanted Melissa and Jenna distracted, not cornered. The more they believed they were still in control, the less they'd see me in the rearview. In the evenings, I kept my routine unchanged. Dinner if she was home. A kiss at the door if she wasn't. The performance of a man who didn't suspect a thing. Inside, I was taking notes, tracking which nights she spent with Jenna, and which nights her car ended up somewhere else. Every detail was ammunition, but I didn't plan to fire until the barrel was full. The next step was people. Through a second company I controlled, Vanguard Apex Solutions, I started reaching out to some of Brightcore's key partners. Not publicly, not with offers that would look like poaching. Just quiet conversations about emerging opportunities and more favorable terms for their current work. A few bites at first, then more. Executives who'd been with Brightcore for years agreed to coffee meetings with my team, just to see what was out there. I knew the right levers to pull. I wasn't just offering better money, I was offering stability. Brightcore's growing reputation problem made that pitch easy. If you believed the right rumors, and plenty of people did, you'd think Jenna's operation was teetering on the edge. The beauty of it was that none of it pointed to me. Weston Vale was the investor. Vanguard Apex was the opportunity. Ethan, Melissa's husband, was just a man who sometimes showed up at charity galas looking mildly bored. By the time the first partner terminated their contract with Brightcore, I'd already lined up 2 more to follow. The official reason was always something bland, budget shifts, strategic realignment, but I knew better. Jenna was losing her anchors, one line item at a time. Melissa didn't say much about it at first. Over dinner one night, she mentioned that things were hectic at work, and Jenna's under a lot of pressure. I kept my expression sympathetic. That must be hard for her, I said. It's temporary, she replied too quickly, stabbing her fork into her salad. We've been through worse. I smiled and changed the subject, letting her believe I hadn't noticed the faint crease of worry between her eyebrows. Behind the scenes, the pressure kept building. The anonymous tips about financial misconduct started circulating. Carefully sourced from real documents I'd obtained months earlier. I never accused, only implied, and implication travels faster than proof. Soon, Brightcore's name started popping up in less flattering contexts. Risk assessments, internal memos at competitor firms, notes from skittish investors asking pointed questions. Every whisper was another thread pulled from the fabric of Jenna's credibility. And Melissa, bound to Jenna both professionally and, apparently personally, couldn't avoid feeling the draft. There was one more layer I wanted in place before I made a move. Melissa's affair wasn't just a betrayal, it was leverage. I didn't need to broadcast it, I needed it ready. In the corporate world, reputational risk is a shadow no one wants in their boardroom. I gathered every receipt, every itinerary, every photograph from Miami and elsewhere into a single airtight dossier. The kind that, if it landed on the right desk, would make someone's position untenable overnight. I stored copies in multiple places. Printed versions in a safety deposit box. Digital versions encrypted and hidden behind layers of meaningless file names. No matter what happened, the evidence wouldn't vanish. All that remained was to wait for the right moment to use it. Waiting wasn't hard anymore. Not when every day brought a new tremor under Brightcore's feet. Not when I knew that the people who had treated me like an afterthought were slowly walking toward a cliff they couldn't see. At home, I played the part perfectly, asked about her day, offered to make her tea, laughed at the appropriate moments. Inside, I was measuring distance, counting down, because when the moment came, I wouldn't raise my voice. I'd simply let the floor drop out from under them.